Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Matt. I'm with the Ohio LTAP Center here at ODOT, and I will be your host for this webinar. Today's research results webinar is excavator comparison, wheel versus track, and we're excited to have John Puente as our presenter today. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items to ensure a smooth webinar experience for everyone. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the questions panel on your screen. You can type your questions there and we will address them during the dedicated Q&A session at the end. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties or have any other issues, feel free to use the chat panel to communicate with our team and we'll do our best to assist you. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available to all registered attendees after the session, along with a PDF of the presentation from today's webinar. All right, with that out of the way, let's get started. It's my pleasure to hand it over to John. John, the virtual floor is yours.
All right, thank you. So my name is John Puente. I am the Data Solutions Director at Cultivate Geospatial, and I was the principal investigator for this research project, along with Munir from the University of Cincinnati. We are happy to be here today and glad that you guys could participate with us on this. I'm going to start off the presentation, but I'm going to go ahead and shut off my camera just so we don't have issues with bandwidth. There's the ability to ask questions during the webinar, and we'll take those right after we're finished here. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and get ourselves started. Maybe. There we go. All right, so I'd like to start off by thanking FHWA and especially the Ohio Department of Transportation and the Office of Statewide Planning and Research Group for helping to manage this project. And a special thanks to Jennifer Spriggs and the Technical Advisory Committee for overseeing this effort. The research project itself was conducted by Cultivate Geospatial and the University of Cincinnati, and it's centered around the evaluation of rubber-wheeled versus track-based excavators. So here's what the research project was actually trying to accomplish. First, that ODOT utilizes track excavators exclusively as their primary excavation equipment, and then that they realize that there are certain limitations of its use, like reduced mobility, deliberate transportation from site to site, and a need for a larger set of workers because of it. What this did was this led ODOT to wanting to evaluate rubber-wheeled excavators in comparison with track-wheeled excavators. So we concentrated on things like operational, financial, and then logistical comparisons between the two types of equipment. And then later we realized that we should also include the grade-all information for this too, because that's an equipment type that's been used across the US and also within the Ohio DOT. So this is what we're tasked to do. We were supposed to evaluate any potential advantages of rubber-wheeled excavators, benchmark what other states are doing, assess the value of a mixed fleet, and then add some deliverable action items on top of that, or recommendations. All right, so let's get started on what we learned as part of our discovery. Our first step was to perform multi-state benchmarking, starting with the survey. Okay, so our TAC lead, which was Doug Burke, was able to submit the survey via the Equipment Manager Technical Services Program. There's a mailing list that's available, and he's part of a committee that's nationwide that allowed us to reach out across the nation to any number of individuals in the DOTs. So this helped us to push that out all across the nation. And we actually got some decent results. We had 16 states that responded, and then 10 of those states later volunteered to sit in on a detailed interview. I'm gonna try the camera, guys. Let's see if we can get this back. Okay, we'll try it with it on for a while. All right, so the initial survey actually targeted state-level fleet managers, equipment directors, and transportation managers. Our goal was to get the views and experience of the folks that made managerial decisions on things like the equipment selection process, procurement, and developing field deployment strategies. So essentially, what we wanted to do is we wanted to contact those that could answer why they chose to go the route they did in each of those states. Here's a list of the type of questions we asked in the survey. What equipment types and models they had in their fleet, how they chose to buy that equipment, what were the strengths and the weaknesses they experienced with their choices, were there any safety considerations, what did they experience in transportation logistics, and then finally, what did their repair history or their maintenance experience look like? Initial findings found that wheeled and grade all type machines were actually preferred in states with high emergency response. We found that steep slopes and tip overs were a major concern, as well as driver blind spots while operating and actually moving the equipment. We also heard that the repair and maintenance were often flagged as higher lifetime costs with wheeled and grade all, especially with the limitations of dealer networks in some of those states. These answers actually led us to believe that we could actually go more in depth with these states. So we took advantage of the survey and asked them if anyone was willing to talk to the research team. And as I mentioned, we had 10 states that actually volunteered. So we were able to coordinate with 5 of those states to actually take a deeper dive. And then each one of those interviews were structured around about 15 to 20 additional specific questions that were geared towards the way that they answered their survey response. Okay, and then those were organized into 4 areas. We concentrated on the fleet composition and their scale. We asked them about transportation logistics, safety programs, and then their fleet strategy altogether. Okay, let's talk about Idaho. This is our first state. So here's what we heard. With Idaho, we concentrated on their mountainous terrain that they had to deal with, and including a talk about mudslides, how they handled avalanches, debris flows, and then especially emergency response. What was their tactics and their plan around that? And then they were actually the most terrain-driven state that we talked to during this time. So let's look at their equipment acquisition. Idaho is very proactive in their fleet planning with district managers. Each of their 6 districts make equipment requests, and then central office approves it. They also write the specs for the equipment and then handle all of the procurement process. So all of this happens through a budget approval process that moves from each of these 6 districts all the way through to the governor. Okay, and as you can see from the slide, it's actually a 5-year plan with central office taking the lead in organizing it all. This part's interesting. Idaho has a buyback program, which was very interesting. They worked with major vendors to develop a program where the dealer would buy back the equipment that they sold the DOT after around 18 to 30 months. And what this did was it lowered operational costs under a bumper-to-bumper warranty, and then it produced favorable terms because of the volume purchases. So both the vendor was happy and the DOT was happy. So that's kind of a cool thing, something that I personally hadn't heard of myself. So the interesting thing was that they distributed their purchases around their working seasons. So they would purchase more loaders and graders in the winter, and then turn around in the summer and switch out for equipment like a fleet of excavators and backhoes. So what this did was this optimized their equipment fleet to meet operational needs season by season. And then this is actually something that we recommended looking into at the Ohio DOT. Emergency response. Okay, Idaho had a very rigorous training and certification program in place for emergency response, including avalanche rescue training. They also position maintenance sheds near dangerous avalanche locations that enable very quick deployment of equipment and personnel during these emergency responses. They also had a monitor for avalanches. So they had individuals that were tasked with monitoring those sites, and they looked at those conditions very closely and were able to shut down the site if conditions became dangerous to the traveling public, which also gave them time to pre-plan and be able to have equipment out a lot quicker as a response. I threw this in here just so you can see the kind of thing that they were dealing with in the winter. So you can see the snow banks on the left-hand side. They're pretty large. So this actually came from a local TV station video that talked about Idaho's emergency response effort and equipment selections. It was interesting actually talking with Idaho in that their excavator choices required a more rugged version of equipment to help maintain the road network. Because they're in the mountainous region, they were looking at very large excavators, and I'll talk about those size differences for the equipment selection process here in just a few slides. All right, moving on. Let's talk about Louisiana. Louisiana was actually the most compelling wheeled excavator success story because they use wheeled excavators way beyond basic earthwork. They also have a two-person emergency program that we'll look at as part of the research summary and recommendations for the Ohio DOT. This DOT pointed out that there are distinct differences between wheeled excavators and their quick deployment for emergency response. They talked about requiring fewer personnel to transport and to operate a wheeled excavator. So they also came equipped with the emergency lights. They came equipped with cameras and signals for independent operations. So it took a lot fewer crew members in order to operate this equipment and to push it out quickly in emergency response. This state had 11 wheeled excavators with even more coming. And that actually all started with one district. The one district purchased it and it kind of experimented with the wheeled excavator, and the others are seeing how effective they were, and now they're wanting the same type of equipment for their crews. All right, let's talk about how they're actually set up to buy equipment. Louisiana has a centralized procurement model where headquarters actually holds the budget. They allocate the funds, and then they actually process the district equipment request. What this means, though, is that the districts have the final say on what to purchase, and that includes the guidance from and handling of the contracts that actually comes from central office. So central office, while they can give recommendations, have kind of a hands-off, and the districts are able to choose what equipment types that they need and the sizes that they need based off of their experience within their own areas. Okay. As I mentioned on the other slide, the wheeled excavator models are becoming increasingly popular, and they're actually being requested more often as time goes on. They're getting used to the equipment. They're seeing what it can do. It's very flexible with equipment attachments if you get the right models. Louisiana also utilizes, or they created what's called an operator certification program. They developed this with LSU, and it actually consists of an 80-hour course and a test for each of the equipment types and models. And because there's significant differences in those excavator equipment types, they actually plan on creating separate certifications for each one of those, covering both operations and terrain limitations as part of the new program. One good thing about their training program is that the operators themselves can retake the certification course if they happen to fail the first time around, or if they can choose to work someplace else and it doesn't affect them or their career in doing so. So it gives those operators options in trying to pass the training courses in order to be able to operate these types of equipment, which is nice. Louisiana actually performs most excavator repairs in-house. This differs from what we just said about Idaho, because Idaho has the vendor do most things because everything's under warranty, right? What they do is they actually utilize the dealer at times when there's bigger repair issues. And as I mentioned, this differs from what Idaho does with their buyback program, because that vendor will assume all of that maintenance under the warranty. So this state actually reported that they have a very large dealer network, which makes it easy for them to obtain parts. So that plays into how they maintain their equipment themselves. But they recommended to ODOT that ODOT secure dealers with strong services and part support located in different parts of the state to help drive down the repair costs and equipment downtime, because you don't have to rely on somebody else to fix your equipment and the transport of that equipment to the dealer, which adds to that downtime. Okay, grade-alls. The grade-all limitations were the reason that Louisiana actually began looking for equipment with broader capabilities. And it was actually the biggest reason for beginning a phase out of that type of equipment. And that's not to say that the Gradall doesn't have a place in your fleet. Overall, states concluded that the Gradall was best suited as a piece of specialized equipment, and they can deploy that where their unique capabilities actually provide clear operational value. For those of you that are interested, you can see on the screen there that we documented a Gradall capabilities report that actually outlines the pros and cons of the Gradall, along with a side-by-side summary that compared the functionalities to both the wheeled and the tracked excavators. And all of this was part of the final package that we delivered to the Ohio DOT. So there's going to be a number of reports that I'm mentioning here that were part of the larger package and not just the final FHWA deliverables. All right, let's move on to Maryland. Maryland had the most deliberate mixed fleet and equipment strategy. What they did is they focused on multi-use machines based on performance advantage and for each one of those types of the excavators that they chose. Okay, so for them, their follow-up call focused on unpacking their methods and talking about the cost of actually maintaining that mixed fleet and what the implications were for doing so. What we heard from Maryland was that they actually had a Gradall in their inventory for decades, basically because the operators were so familiar with the equipment. And this actually serves as a large part of the resistance to change from the Gradall. But that being said, they claimed that the overall Gradall numbers are actually dwindling because new equipment types are being purchased that have more functionality. So their operators are actually noticing now that there's some limitations and the lack of versatility of that type of equipment for more modern operations. They're trying to be more flexible and be able to utilize more attachments to do different types of work, basically. Okay. They noted that their equipment purchases are now being influenced largely by geography and the overall flexibility of the use of the equipment itself, which affects the suitability of the Gradall to meet their needs. And you'll see in the report that I just mentioned that there are a number of attachments that can be utilized between these three pieces of equipment, and each one of those is broken down into exactly what attachments are suitable. All right. The need to purchase versatile equipment and increase operation to lower the ownership costs are a big driver for the DOT. They found that the rubber-wheeled excavators are very flexible and can handle an array of attachment choices, like I mentioned, right? Maryland also shared examples of using those rubber-wheeled excavators for clearing debris from floods and the flexibility of the equipment for rapid emergency deployments. Again, for those of you that may be interested, there is an attachment type readiness report, I think I called it, for each of those equipment types that we reviewed as part of this overall project. Okay, Maryland mentioned that purchasing extended warranties and preventive maintenance packages from dealers actually helped them keep their fleet running and operational. So there wasn't a lot of downtime, or not as much downtime, I should say. They're also big on training, where certification programs were mentioned, just like the other states. One thing that they highlighted was the importance of a local dealer and their competence in both operations and repairs, and not just for sales, because the technology and the equipment often outpaced the mechanical skills that were available to them. So the technicians often weren't able to keep up locally within the DOT with the technology that was changing at a very fast rate. So lastly, they talked about long-term purchasing programs. This gave their technicians ample time to get hands-on experience while building relationships with those dealers where they purchased or rented their equipment from. All right, suggestions for Maryland. Maryland suggested choosing equipment that had multiple hydraulic circuits. This is the first time that we heard this in our conversations. What this is they're requesting or recommending multiple hydraulic circuits and high flow capacities. because what this does is it helps to support a large range of attachments and gives that piece of equipment a lot of flexibility. They also stress partnering with local vendors who can support and train their operators on equipment maintenance. Okay, so you have technicians that are learning from the vendor, and you may have operators that are being trained by the vendor, in this case, as Maryland's been doing. And then finally, they recommended choosing equipment that meets each one of those districts' geography, their terrain, and their soil types. So it's something that we've heard developing, right? So each one of these states that we're talking to, and I'm summarizing, is actually developing a pattern here. Virginia. Virginia had a unique situation where maintenance staff and specifically operators preferred the grade all product that they were accustomed to, while their management, though, is actively pursuing the adoption of large wheeled excavators. In this case, for the call framing, we actually took a look at why management was wanting to move on to a different equipment type. Virginia noted that some of their operators rather wanted to stick with what they know, but that there was actually a growing interest in wheeled excavators as the operators learned more about them. They also suggested that some of their districts may have already justified purchasing wheeled excavators based on rental expenditures of that type of equipment that they've had over a period of time. And this is something that we are recommending to the Ohio DOT to take a look at. What is your rental history from all the districts and the rental equipment itself? Because that may help to justify the use of the wheeled excavators. As with most of the other states, Virginia actually highlighted equipment choices again based on terrain and their work type. And then one major item that they identified was having both what they called a centralized and decentralized governance model that kind of influenced their overall decisions. And what that means is that the budget is handled centrally, and the equipment itself and those requests and those justifications actually come from the districts and the regions, and then central office helps with that procurement process. All right, Virginia was like some of the other states we've already interviewed and we talked about, and they had a very robust operator training program. They actually trained their operators rather on each of those equipment types, and the program itself is actually coordinated by central office. So you're seeing a lot of similarities between these states now, talking about why they have the equipment, how they train, how they purchase, how they maintain, and those sorts of things. One thing that Virginia did point out, though, is they don't have an equipment sharing calendar as a single source of tracking shared equipment. And this becomes kind of important when managing a mixed fleet, and especially when you have the need to share equipment between counties or regions to make the best of your budget and your equipment use. The other big thing was actually that the managers actually have the authority to approve contractor equipment and for each of the jobs that they're hired to help with. And each of those work sites are going to be unique, but so the managers have the ability to say, this is the type of equipment we want you to bring in under this contract. And that's actually before the project begins. So that was kind of unique in that they're telling the contractors the types of equipment that they can utilize for the mitigation. All right, our last state, this is New York. They submitted the widest variety of excavator types and also the widest variety of transportation challenges for all the states that we actually interviewed. Our goal here was to unpack how the New York DOT actually managed a large mixed fleet. New York has 91 excavators. 42 of them are tracked, 49 are wheeled, and then they also have additional grade hauls, right? They told us that they're in the process of trying to standardize the equipment to simplify a number of things: training, maintenance, and then their parts inventory. So, that helps to drive down the total cost if you don't have a large fleet, especially if there are different makes and models. So they're trying to curb that by simplifying that. Their choices again were based off of weather conditions, soil and work type, and just like all the other states that I've been summarizing here. But they also noted that they do share equipment across the state to help drive down total cost. Not every district will need every piece of equipment within their inventory because it's not used all the time, so it can be shared across those different boundaries. New York, again, has both a centralized and a regional procurement process. Uh, most of the purchases actually come from central office, and then some of it comes from the regions, um, which are meant to address very specific needs. But they said that 90% of the budget itself and the purchasing is actually done through a central office. Each region will actually work with central office to create operational plans and final equipment lists. And the job of the central office fleet group itself is to help each region make informed decisions, including choosing the right dealer and managing their support contracts. So it's a partnership, and it's managed both locally and at the regional and the central office level. The equipment selection, that was very similar to the other states. They make the choices based on, again, terrain, weather, soil conditions, site situations, those sorts of things. Their equipment operators, they mentioned, have a minimum of a Class B CDL with an air brake endorsement, and then some of them actually have a Class A with an additional trailer endorsement. And then another comment that they noted was with the tracked elevators that they had to set up work zones sometimes when they were loading and unloading those tracked excavators. It's basically like the other states had experienced and that I've talked through already through here. The tracked excavators require a low boy, they require more people, they require maintenance of traffic sometimes, and closing down a lane in order to get the excavator on and off, that sort of thing. But it's something that's expected with that big piece of equipment, and they're trying to reduce the amount of damage to the road as they're doing those loading procedures. New York actually had the similar issue seen across the country, and that was that the budgets have to be stretched. They do this by extending the life of the pieces of equipment, or keeping the equipment longer than you expected. They also noted that rising costs and the complexity of running new models, including increased maintenance costs, are to keep them running. The let's talk quickly about the mechanics. They mentioned that there was a shortage of skilled mechanics and dealers, which creates a very long wait period for equipment to be fixed, and it often produce extended downtimes. So remember, I just talked a few states ago where they mentioned creating a partnership with local vendors to make sure that they have the right personnel in place to not only maintain your choices of equipment, but also to help to train your operators at the same time. So New York is basically reiterating what we just talked about. All right, so let's talk about our research findings. We came up with a findings document from all the states that we surveyed and we interviewed, and we took a deep dive with some of those states, and that led us to the following information. Number one, there is no universal solution. There is no one piece of equipment that can do it all. So a mixed fleet of excavators was highly encouraged in most states. Transportation. Getting equipment from one site to another was a big factor in each of the states' choices. As tracked excavators, like we talked about, required a lowboy trailer, multiple people to load and to move it, and then sometimes those maintenance of traffic and work zones being set up. The third bullet point, the regional differences. The states across the U.S. are very diverse in soil types, ground conditions, slopes, and their dominant terrain. So this actually played a huge part in the decision of what equipment to buy, right? So this resonated through all of the interviews that we conducted And this is something that we actually talked about as part of our recommendations to the Ohio DOT in doing a pilot project that looked at different terrains and different districts. We'll talk about that here in just a second. All right, so when it comes to safety, most of the comments, again, were around the size and the type of equipment, and specifically about purchasing advanced features like cameras and sensors to help the operator. That helps them in both the loading and unloading, as well as the use of the equipment itself. And then lastly, operator training. That was a big deal with all of our experts. They pointed out big differences between the different types of equipment, excuse me, and excavator types. And they detailed very structured training certification programs for each of those types of models. So those were part of our recommendation to the DOT as part of the summarizing of our discussions with and the research that we did with these models. Okay, so let's talk about the recommendations themselves, but we're also going to talk a little bit about some of the tools we developed as part of the research to help the Ohio DOT in making decisions on the equipment type that they could utilize. The first is an excavator decision tree. This is a tool that we developed for ODOT to help ODOT choose the correct excavator type, built off of what we heard in our research and the DOT interviews. The decision tree itself evaluates site conditions, mobility requirements, work zone constraints, soil conditions, and then the excavation use. And it guides you through a recommendation to the appropriate excavator type and size class, which you can see in that box on the left-hand side. So basically what it does is it formalizes the decision-making process by walking the user through all the considerations pointed out by the peer states in their own decision-making. This is actually a very handy tool. It's not a all-encompassing, this is what is going to be purchased because of it. This is actually just a tool to help you to make your decision. And it's used in partner with the next one that we're going to show here. And this is also an equipment selection scorecard. So this serves as a scoring matrix that managers can use to evaluate competing equipment options. So what it does is it allows the users to compare both wheeled and tracked excavators side by side by applying the weighted criteria among categories like, on the left-hand side, you'll see the categories: mobility, stability and ground performance, surface impact damage, maintenance, safety, and life cycle costs. And what it does is you can apply your own weights on what it means to you in your area, whether it's a county or a district purchase, or if you're doing it statewide, you're looking at that region. It provides a total score for each of the wheeled and tracked excavator models, which can then be used to supplement the decision tree and then validate your reason for buying the pieces of equipment. And if you look on the right-hand side, we actually applied some recommended weighting models. So if you're operating in a district or area that's primarily urban, there are some weighted averages that, or weight percentages that you could utilize in this model. If you're operating in a rural area or something that's terrain dominant, you can also utilize those recommendations. And then there's a scoring scale from 1 to 5 as to what is the best fit, 1 being poor and 5 being ideal. You probably will never get to a 5, but you'll at least be able to compare your choices of a wheeled excavator score compared to a track excavator. They're in the same spreadsheet, so you can look at them side by side and apply your weights as you see fit. Because remember, you're looking at different concepts when it comes to utilizing tracked excavators as opposed to wheeled excavators. That decision tree asks you about, you know, what type of excavation you're doing, what kind of terrain you're on, are you in an urban area, so on and so forth. So these two tools combined will actually help you to make your decisions, and as well as what we recommended for ODOT. Okay, let's jump into our recommendations. Number 1, is to initiate a wheeled excavator pilot in 2 or more ODOT districts. The reason that we're talking about this is actually the second bullet point. We're asking or recommending that the Ohio DOT do this because those pieces of equipment are going to act differently in different terrains. So how is a wheeled excavator going to act in a hilly terrain in Southeast Ohio as compared to a flat terrain in Northwest Ohio? So we want to make sure that their findings are based off of comparable decisions. Okay. The next one is to define pre-measurable outcomes. So basically KPIs, right? Deployment response time, your crew size that's required for these jobs when it comes to a wheeled excavator, the number of trailer moves that are eliminated per week by not using tracked excavators, and the number of individual sites that it can actually be served per day. When you're using tracked excavators, it requires a great number of people and effort to move from site to site, whereas wheeled excavators and gradles can be driven from site to site. So what kind of numbers are you seeing during your workday or work week? The last bullet point on this one is to benchmark Louisiana's 2-person nighttime emergency response process. It is part of the report. We identify how they're contacted, how they're deployed, what kind of work that they can actually do in emergency response, and it's actually something that can be adopted by the Ohio DOT as part of a pilot program. The next, talking about operator training. Our recommendations were to model after Louisiana's operator training program. Again, remember they had an 80-hour hands-on program as well as testing. There are also written exams, and they also give them the opportunity to take those exams over should they not pass. There are individuals that are very, very good at operating equipment, but may not be as proficient as in taking a test. Maybe they get nervous. So giving them that second opportunity is something that's going to be valuable to the Ohio DOT in getting the type of personnel that they need educated and trained on these types of equipment. When it comes to certifications, the recommendation is to separate wheeled certifications from track certifications, and they might even want to separate the different models of these types of pieces of equipment. And then the last bullet point is to model this in-house training after New York's structured program benchmarks, and we provided that as part of our reports and our findings. Dual hydraulic circuits. We want ODOT to take into consideration what Maryland is considering for their procurement, which is a minimum of 2 hydraulic circuits on the undercarriage. And basically what that allows them to do is have a bigger choice or flexibility in choosing the attachment types for wheeled excavators based off of those dual hydraulic circuits. They felt in Maryland that what this does is it provides the justification for multi-purpose fleet equipment, which is that wheeled excavator in a fleet that has a number of different types of equipment. And then lastly, that ODOT should incorporate this specification regardless of a wheeled excavator option. So when you're looking at even tracked excavators, making sure that there's a minimum of 2 hydraulic circuits to be able to utilize more of those attachment opportunities. Okay, equipment rental records. Virginia confirmed in our discussions that some districts have accumulated rental expenditures on wheeled equipment, and that they can use that as justification to be able to purchase equipment of this type. This data alone won't justify the purchase, but it does give you a heads up in identifying that there is a need for that equipment in those areas. Yeah, so the last one is basically that they're looking at what those rental costs sustain over multiple years, and that those districts themselves that are purchasing those types of equipment could be those pilot programs that you want to adopt while you're trying to do this pilot at the Ohio DOT. Idaho's buyback program, that was pretty slick. Remember that they had a buyback program where every 18 to 30 months they returned the piece of equipment and they got another round of equipment. So brand new equipment and everything under the vendor warranties and maintenance repair contracts. So it was a nice thing for them, for Idaho, because they didn't have to spend so much on maintenance themselves because it was handled under the warranties. Let's see. ODOT, their recommendation from Idaho was that ODOT should evaluate whether their procurement volume and vendor relationships could support this type of program. So it's something that Ohio should look into. And then rotating those purchases was another slick idea, where during the winter months, they would have a fleet of certain equipment to help for the winter season. And then during the summer, they would have more tracked and wheeled excavators in the summer months, because that's when they could utilize and take advantage of those pieces of equipment. Site conditions, what they recommended here was to develop and distribute standards. Make sure that there's a program out there that everybody understands what those standards are. This could be anything from operating the excavators to tying them down, and those kind of things that they'll pick up in the training programs. Also, when you're doing purchases, they recommend, as part of this program, that you specify a camera and alarm system as standard equipment on wheeled excavators. And then Texas actually confirmed that those cameras effectively mitigate safety concerns, both on the road and especially while in use. So as you're in transport and the unloading and loading of any types of equipment like this, they're in good use. When you're driving a wheeled excavator down the road, having these additional cameras and sensors, just like you do in your advanced vehicles nowadays, your newer vehicles, they're actually a great thing to have. And lastly, in just deploying the decision tree and the scorecard that we just went over, these will be tools that can help ODOT to make decisions on the types and the models of excavator that they're actually choosing. And Virginia took a look at this during our call, and they actually affirmed that the decision tree is actually a nice little tool to have. Okay, we're getting towards the end. So we'll talk about steps for deployment. Again, identify 2 pilot districts at minimum with flat terrains and rolling hill terrains, so you can get an idea of how these pieces of equipment operate in each one of those conditions. Develop an excavator procurement specification, and this should be complete again with hydraulic circuits, the dual hydraulic circuits, cameras, multi-attachment capabilities, those sorts of things. Develop an operator certification network. Again, this is the training part of it. Take a look at your historical rental records, do an audit on that. Develop evaluation metrics, and those are KPIs, and I'll talk about those just in the next slide again. And also identify what success looks like, and do this before you go out and procure or you rent any pieces of equipment in order to do this evaluation. When you rent or purchase those units, make sure that the operators are trained in these units prior to their use in this pilot, and then run the pilot for a minimum of 1 full operational season and see what those results are like. You want to see what they're like in each one of the conditions, each one of the weather situations, terrains, and so on and so forth. Here's just a very rough deployment time frame. In months 1 through 3, the TAC can review the pilot program, design, and also the procurement specifications for the pieces of equipment that you want to get. In 3 through 6, and some of these are overlapping, so it's not a concrete 1 through 3 months and 3 through 6. Take a look at your rental records. Select your pilot districts, and then start engaging with your vendors and the bid process to procure these pieces of equipment. And the next step, that's when you get your equipment delivery and your operators are certified in being able to operate those pieces of equipment safely and to move them from location to location and then use them for mitigation and maintenance purposes. And through for the next 9 months, then your pilots will actually, or excuse me, your operators will use these pieces of equipment and collect data and report back, so you can start tracking what their pros and cons are of utilizing these pieces of equipment in certain conditions and with certain work types. I should say work sites. And then lastly, do the pilot evaluation report. Find out what the good things, the bad things, the expectations, and the wish list are from your operators, and produce a report and provide fleet-wide procurement recommendations based off of what your experiences are as part of that. I talked about KPIs, right? So here's some recommended KPIs for the pilot. And this isn't set in stone. These are just things that we're recommending that you may want to be able to track. Your deployment response time. That's tracking your time, your effort, and your people, right? The number of sites served each day. The total number of trailer moves that have been eliminated by piloting wheeled excavators. The tracking, the use of the different types of attachments and that multi-function capability that we're talking about. Track what your maintenance costs per hour are. As part of the entire package that we deliver to the Ohio DOT, there are some operational use guidelines. We have broken down between grade-alls, wheeled excavators and large excavators, and also the sizes, or not the sizes, but the types. And it breaks down how much it costs per hour to use, maintain, so on and so forth. Track your own numbers there. And then what is your operator certification completion rate? Within those pilot districts, how many operators actually got certified in order to do this testing? The more you can get certified, the more you can have experience, the more opinions you'll get, and you'll be able to produce a much better outcome on your deliverable. All right, so finally, we actually feel that ODOT is the perfect state for a mixed fleet of equipment that can take advantage of and the flexibility of wheeled excavators. And as we mentioned, each of these pieces of equipment adds value to their maintenance and operation responsibilities. They each have a place within the fleet for ODOT. It doesn't mean that every single district or county has to have a piece of equipment of these certain types, but they could certainly take advantage of the flexibility of using rubber wheeled excavators, and especially the flexibility with the attachment types and the different work that you can actually produce from those. So that wraps up what I was going to report on as part of this presentation. So if we'd like to open this up for questions. Do we have any questions yet?
Thank you, John. At this time, I don't see any questions waiting in the panel. So for those of you listening in, if anyone has any questions they'd like to put forward, now would be a great time. All right, John, not seeing any questions coming in.
Okay.
So with that, I'll initiate wrapping this up. So that's all the time we're going to have for today. On behalf of LTAP and ODOT, I'd like to thank John once again for sharing his valuable knowledge and expertise with us. Just a couple final reminders as we sign off. Be sure to keep an eye on your inbox. We'll be sending out the link to the session recording to all registered attendees very soon. If you were logged in and present for the full duration of the webinar, you will receive a certificate of attendance within 5 business days. As we close out, a very short 4-question survey will pop up in your browser. If you have 60 seconds, please let us know your thoughts. It really does help us fine-tune these programs for your benefit. Thank you all for being with us today. We hope you're walking away with some great insights for your work. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and we'll see you at the next one.
All right. Thank you, folks.
Thanks, John.